Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallette, and thanks for being with us. On this episode, we're taking a step back from the news cycle to take a look at the fascinating and sometimes surprising history of a cornerstone of American political life, the citizen-initiated ballot measure. If you live in one of the 26 states where citizens can put laws directly on the ballot, you've probably seen these measures pop up during elections, deciding everything from property taxes and abortion rights to marijuana legalization and ranked choice voting. Have you wondered, where does this process come from? Or how has it become so powerful and perhaps sometimes controversial tool in American politics? If you've been following Ballotpedia for a while, well, you'll know that ballot measures are bread and butter. They're pretty much what started it all here for us back in 2007. So, ballot measures are pretty fascinating, and we thought it might be fun to have an episode where we talk a little bit more about them without just settling on the day-to-day. The initiative process has its roots in a time of upheaval over a century ago when the balance of power in the U.S. was shifting in dramatic ways. And many Americans felt their government no longer worked for them. So from these frustrations, kind of a radical idea emerged. Well, what if citizens didn't have to wait for politicians to act? What if they could just draft proposals for their own laws, gather support from their neighbors, and put them directly on the ballot? So in the United States, the idea became reality in 1898 in South Dakota. The tool became a staple of the progressive era in American history. So today you'll hear my interviews with 4 separate experts in this episode, taking us on a journey from that very first measure to those that we see today across the country. It's our longest episode to date, jam-packed with fascinating stories, surprising statistics, and unique perspectives. So buckle up, I'm glad you're here. First, I'll be joined by John Matsusaka from the University of Southern California, making his second appearance on the show, and we're glad to have him back. He is going to walk us through some of the early history and to highlight how the initiative process has evolved from those early days over the course of the 20th century. From there, we'll fast forward to the modern era with maybe our most frequent guest on the show, Ballotpedia's own managing editor over our ballot measures coverage, Ryan Byrne, who will give us the highs and lows of ballot measure usage over time. They'll tease out the forces that determine why some initiatives succeed while others fail, share some of our own analysis from the last few years, and explain the strategies campaigns use to qualify initiatives for the ballot today. In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by 2 newcomers to the pod. First, by Dane Waters, an advocate for direct democracy and a founder of the Initiative Referendum Institute. He spent decades advocating for citizen lawmaking, both in the United States and around the world. We thought he'd be the perfect person to help bring us inside the process from the grassroots to the global scale. And finally, we'll hear from Dan Smith at the University of Florida, who will help us connect this historical journey to what's happening right now. Dan will peel back the curtain on the political tug-of-war between legislatures and citizens over ballot measures. Are these tools still a way to give power back to people, or have they become battlegrounds for special interests? You'll notice that some of our guest answers overlap a bit. For example, we asked each of them what topics and issues they think could dominate the landscape over the next several years to come, or whether more states could adopt the initiative process in the future. But we think that's all part of what we do best here at On the Ballot, arming you with all kinds of data, anecdotes, and perspectives so you can make up your own mind. By the end of this episode, you might just find yourself rethinking what you know or thought you knew about how democracy works in America. So join us as we uncover the origins, evolution, and controversies of citizen-initiated ballot measures, one fascinating story at a time. Let's dive in. Hey, John, welcome back to the show.
Jeff, thanks for having me on.
I'm very excited to have you on to really step back and talk about the sort of history behind ballot issues. So tell our listeners a little bit, John, when did Americans start looking around at government and say, maybe we want to take a bit more of a direct role in shaping policies? This wasn't something that was baked into the original Constitution. So when did this all come to pass?
Yeah, so it's great we're having this conversation because we spend a lot of time just talking about the issues of the day. So it's great to go back and say the big picture because I think it helps understand a lot of the issues of the day when you see the story. You're absolutely right. The U.S. Constitution doesn't have any kind of direct democracy at all, famously in that sense. We're one of the few countries that doesn't have any. But what people don't sometimes recognize is that below the national level, we've had direct democracy from the very beginning. And I mean that literally. When it came to ratification of the U.S. Constitution, one state actually held a referendum on whether even to do that. It was Rhode Island. From the very, very beginning, Americans have been voting on issues. And you could even tell stories from, colonial times actually for town meetings and so forth. So it goes way, way back. But what happened is that for about the first 100 years of the country, people were voting on issues. They would be constitutional amendments, for example. The legislature had an idea to change the constitution, so they put it to a vote of the voters, or even adopt a new constitution. Might vote on things like alcohol or location of the state capital and so forth. That was for the first 100 years. But the really big change, and I think the one that more stands out to people, the really big change happened in 1898 when South Dakota adopted the Initiative and Referendum. Okay, now the difference here is that before then, people were voting on issues, but all the issues they were voting on were things that the legislature chose for them to vote on. So the legislature would say, okay, constitutional amendment, you guys want to amend this constitution this way or not? But it was all up to the legislature. What South Dakota did in 1898 is they said, well, actually, the people can actually propose the laws themselves. And they have to go out and have to collect signatures and all that sort of thing. So they started that in 1898. And a whole bunch of states followed in the next 20 years till we ended up around 1920. We ended up with about half the states in the country were allowing people to do this. And that's kind of where we are now.
Was there an issue in South Dakota that that really initiated that, so to speak? What led to South Dakota being the first state?
What was leading all these states, for those people who don't really remember a lot of their American history, especially because this is kind of a time period that goes into a black hole for a lot of people, but it's somewhere between the populist and progressive movements. And the economy in the world just changed dramatically at that time. We went from a bunch of farmers to having a bunch of corporations and industrial production and big railroads and so forth. And what started to emerge was some of these big new industrial enterprises had a lot of political power.
Yeah.
They had a lot of financial resources, and like railroads, legislatures were really literally employees of the railroads. At the same time, they were legislatures and they're trying to regulate them. And at the same time that was happening, there was a lot of immigration going on, and some of the more populous cities were setting up these machines, sort of these urban machines. And what happened as a result of the populist and progressive movement is there was this general fermentation across the country, the feeling that the people had lost control of the government and that the politicians had fallen under control of machines, under control of big corporations. And so there was this thing going across all parts of the country to say we have to retake control of our government in some way. And initiative and referendum was part of a whole menu of kind of reforms that people wanted to do and did at that time.
Well, what's old is new again. It's always menus of reforms and different ideas and people battling them out. Now, in the initial states that got the initiative, were they essentially granted that by state legislatures? Was there a different method? And the reason why I ask is I can't really imagine today a state legislature deciding, you know what? Let's give power back to the people and create the initiative in our state. I think most people would not expect a state legislative body in today's political climate
Yep.
to do that. But is that what happened in 1898 in South Dakota? Is the state legislature chose to give that power, or did some other process come about?
So you're right, and it's a sad statement about our elected officials today that they don't want the people to make decisions. It sounds weird to say back then, but back then there were actually two presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, and Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. Two presidents campaigned on this issue. They said everybody should have a vote. We need to solve these problems. Most of the major journalists were reformers. They wanted to have this happen. Everybody thought this was a great idea at the time.
Yep.
What happened in most of these states is that the legislature proposed a constitutional amendment, and then, of course, the voters approved it. In a few cases, there might be a constitutional convention. Now, what partly happened is the progressives managed to take control of some of these governments and, kick out the other parties for some periods of time, or take control of the parties and get this happen. But nowadays, then it kind of stopped. That's why we only have half the states allow initiatives and referendums now.
Now, did it stop because there was some kind of pushback eventually that sort of ceased momentum, or what sort of pushback did activists at the time face?
I don't think we really know that. People who study, historians who study this, political scientists, I don't think people really quite understand it.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at a map, you'll see that the states that have it are largely, not entirely, but largely in the West. And those were kind of new states. They didn't have very established political structures. And so it might have been easier for reformers to kind of penetrate those. Whereas in the old established states, the existing political structures might have been more adept at sort of heading off some of these things and stopping them. Obviously, some exceptions. Massachusetts adopted it, and that was obviously an old state. But by and large, it was these new states, and maybe just the kind of established political machinery responded and stopped it after it spread.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, we're getting this picture together now. You have, America taking shape in the 1800s, 1898 to 1920, this whole progressive era and the adoption of citizen initiated measures. What were some of the key reforms that they really focused on in those early years? What were the more popular and more common initiatives? So, once they finally got the rights to the initiative.
When they first got the right to initiative, they went crazy from a modern perspective. So, like, one of the first ballots in California had 48 propositions on it.
Yeah.
Colorado in 1912, I think, had 32. So there was a ton of pent-up demand, and some of the things.
Yeah. People think 10 today is a lot. Imagine that.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I just wrote a piece on Colorado, and there was some concerns about that. I don't know, 14, and people were saying, how the
Yeah.
sky is falling, what are we gonna do? And I said, "Well, you had 32 like in 1912."
Yeah.
So, and voters
Yeah.
managed to figure it out. But there was a lot of pent-up demand for reform types of issues. So you would see things like direct election of US senators. So again, going back to history, but people may not know this, but when the country first started, we didn't elect our US senators. They were chosen by our legislatures. Eventually, we passed a constitutional amendment to do that. But in the meantime, some states took the matters into their own hands. So that was one reform that the initiative was used to do. It was used to try to advance women's suffrage, because remember back then, in most places in the country, women couldn't vote. It was used to do redistricting types of things, because this was before one person, one vote principle. So there were many districts that were completely or wildly different sizes. And so what had happened kind of historically is that people initially drew their maps and they carved the state up into districts. But over time, what happened is a whole bunch of people moved to the cities. And so you had a few districts, which everybody was living in the cities. They got hardly any votes. So once the voters got control of this, they started to change that as well. So there was a lot of kind of reform things,
Yep.
as you might expect.
Yeah.
There were other issues of the day. Alcohol. There were a lot of votes on alcohol because that was something people were talking about at the time. So stuff like that. And actually pretty early on, they also spent a lot of time trying to think about creating kind of safety net things. So old age pensions,
Yeah.
institutions for the blind and so forth, things that became Social Security at the national level. But the states moved first on a lot of these things when the initiative referendum came around.
Do we know much about what it was like to qualify an initiative back then versus today? So, we know that today, depending on the state you're in, it can require more resources, whether it's more signatures or, distribution of signatures or requirements on signatures or collectors. Was it kind of the same back then, or was it actually like a simpler system in terms of qualifying an initiative? But do we know much about what the path to the ballot, so to speak, was?
Probably everything was simpler back then. There weren't all these disclosure rules and all these kind of regulatory apparatuses. It's probably better we have a lot of these things. It was fairly similar in the sense of, again, for people who aren't totally up in it, but somebody has to write down a proposed law and then go out and collect signatures, and every state has a target number you have to hit. California, it's 5% of the number of votes that were cast in the last governor's election. So you got to go around the state. That's a lot of signatures you got to collect. So people stand around outside grocery stores or shopping malls and so forth and try to get signatures. One thing I learned that was very interesting is that there's one of the controversial things in modern times has been the use of paid signature collectors. Typically now, if you want to collect signatures, we have this idea maybe of these grassroots people. It's like me and you, Jeff, going out and collecting signatures and standing around the corners, but that's not how it works. You actually hire a company that goes out and hires people that go stand around at the corners. So one thing I was very surprised to see as I read some of these histories is that you can go back, the first decade of the 1900s, and people are collecting signatures, and there's paid petitioners.
Oh, yeah, right at the outset.
So they were doing this. They were doing this from the very beginning. So it was always kind of there.
They must have figured out very quickly that volunteer signature gatherers are just not as effective, and you get less bang for your buck than taking long, I guess.
Yeah, exactly right. So, but yeah, but procedurally, it hasn't changed all that much. There's just a lot more apparatus around
Right.
on regulation, trying to prevent fraud and things like that.
So you sort of alluded to this, but what eventually, there was a decline in the quantity of initiatives as we move through the mid 20th century. And what kind of factors do you think led to that sort of decline?
Yeah, so that kind of unsatisfying responses, we don't totally know this, but if you just step back and look at the grand sweep of history, you can see essentially there's three periods. At the beginning, early 20th century, there's a whole bunch of proposals that come on the ballot. Like I mentioned, 48 in California, right? There's a whole bunch of these going on.
Yeah.
And this goes on for about the first 20 or 30 years. And then it kind of stops. And we don't see very many proposals all during the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s. Then it starts to pick up again in the 1970s. And it goes back up in the 1980s to where we are now, which is kind of high. So there's this slow period in the middle. And, I haven't seen any what I would call rigorous evidence, but we kind of know what's happening at the time. It's Great Depression. It's World War II. There's some stuff going on that might be attracting people's attention away from the stuff they were doing before. Plus, maybe they had already gotten a lot of their initial reforms out of the system. A lot of the basic stuff they wanted to do, direct election of U.S. senators, give votes to women and stuff, that had probably already been taken care of. So the kind of low-hanging fruit had been plucked. So maybe it's kind of we got the main stuff taken care of, and now it's the Great Depression and World War II and stuff. So that might have just taken people's eye off it for a while.
Yeah, I could see that. People always say things like, "Oh, do you want to paint the exterior of your house?" Well, sure, but only if we're having a pretty successful job putting food on the table.
Yeah.
If we can't put food on the table, we'll deal with the house later. And yeah, Great Depression, World War II, some pretty heavy stuff going on.
And, the federal government becomes much more active in some of these things too, right? So it could have been, like with Social Security and the old age pensions, it could have been people said, I don't need my state to do this. The feds are taking care of this.
So, what are some just general economic, social, political conditions that seem to drive the popularity of citizen initiatives? Any kind of themes or trends you've seen over the years?
We can trace a lot of the resurgence of initiatives to one proposition in California, which was called Proposition 13 in 1978, which was a very dramatic tax cutting proposal that passed overwhelmingly. And, for those people who don't do the history, they might not realize it, but there was a kind of a very big consensus that grew in this country from kind of 1930 up all the way to the 1970s, which was, let's call it a big government type of approach to things, is that people wanted the government to come in and solve problems. And it kind of get ratcheted up and ratcheted up and ratcheted up. What happened in the 1970s is that the voters, they wanted to put a pause on that a little bit. And this one measure reverberated across the country. It showed everybody, okay, the voters actually want us to slow down a little bit now, and think a little bit about how we're spending money. They don't want ever growing spending. They don't want to cut the state down necessarily, but they don't want to just keep growing without end in sight. So this got front page coverage everywhere in the country. Presidential candidates grabbed this. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1988. Tax cutting was a big part of his measure. So this was kind of an earthquake in the firmament. And I think what it did is two things. First of all, obviously, it had a direct effect on how people thought about the role of government and taxes. But the other thing it did, it reminded people that this process was out there, because I think they had probably forgotten because it wasn't used very much. So then other groups who had their issues went, oh, I can actually bring this to the people if the politicians won't listen to me. So I think people started to learn this, and of course now it's in the news again. And I'm sure now that we've seen, for example, things having to do with very successful things by progressive groups in the last 5-10 years on minimum wage and healthcare and abortion and stuff like that. Other progressive groups will see this, and conservative groups will see it, and they'll go, "Oh, I can do this for my issue too."
Yeah, well, this was the most expensive ballot measure cycle I think certainly we've ever tracked, and you can make a case maybe with inflation you have to track that, but more than $1.25 billion this cycle. So, yeah, everyone sort of within the ballot measures world knows and understands about Prop 13. So, just kind of in a nutshell, what was it really about for listeners who don't even know what that really was? What was that about in California?
Super good question, because I feel like I spend a big chunk of my life, because a lot of people hate it for some reason who are not in California. People tell me why they hate it, and I say, why? And I have to correct them and say, that's not what it did. So what did it do? What it did, very simply, is two things. One, it capped property tax rates. It says you can't go over 1% of the value, period. And the second thing it said is that you can't raise people's property tax rates higher than, roughly speaking, the rate of inflation. And what had happened is that in California at the time in the 1970s, there was high inflation, like seriously high inflation, like well over 10%. And on top of that, housing prices in California have always been high, and they were exploding as well. So you had a lot of people. The most extreme case would be somebody on a fixed income. They're retired, for example. So their income's not going up, but their housing value is going up, and their property taxes are going up just from the assessed value of the house is going up. So they're being asked to pay just enormously high amounts of money. They clamored for years saying, can you please help us out? And the legislature wouldn't do it. And not only that, about 30% or more of the budget, they were running enormous surpluses, and they refused to cut taxes. There were proposals there. They refused to cut taxes. And what happened is there was just a very big frustration amongst the voters, and said, at some point, this isn't right. And so they kind of hit it with a sledgehammer. And I think most people would probably say, even supporters of Proposition 13 would probably say, yeah, hitting things with sledgehammers is not the best way to do it. We'd rather have the legislature go in there and do a nuanced sort of thing. But, sometimes the legislature won't do it. And so hitting with a sledgehammer is better than just letting the thing fester. And that's what the voters thought.
Sure. Now, at the time, did people think it was going to fail? Like when it was getting covered before the election, was it projected to lose, or was it a big surprise that it actually did win? Or was it kind of like once it got on the ballot, all the coverage and the trends, people kind of knew it was about to pass?
Well, I think as it got close enough, people started to realize, but I think the assumption going in was that it would fail. There had been very similar measures. So remember, this happened in 1978. There had been very similar measures. Ronald Reagan, when he was the governor, sponsored a very similar measure in 1973 that narrowly lost. There was a similar measure 1971, 1968 that lost as well. So I think that the feeling was that, well, voters, they really don't mean it when they actually are faced with it. And on top of all that, it's hard to imagine now, but the establishment was just uniformly against it. The then governor at the time, Jerry Brown, spent 100% of his time, crisscrossing the state, trying to get people to vote this down. All the Democrats opposed it, but all the Republicans did as well. All the main people who later became governors or were the legislative leaders opposed it. All the major corporations disapproved it. The Republicans opposed it. All the major corporations opposed it. All the major media outlets opposed it. All the powers that be opposed it. The only people who actually support it were those, 78% of ordinary Californians who voted for it. So I think people thought, well, it's weirdly, in a way now that as I'm saying this, it's kind of vaguely Trumpian in some sense in the era we're in, where the elites really don't want to go down this path, but the voters kind of revolted and said, well, we want it, because it was really uniformly all these sort of establishment figures on both parties were against Proposition 13.
How quickly did that sort of cause a chain reaction? Was it 1979 you suddenly saw a big spike, or 1980, or did it take a few more years after that?
Well, the tax revolt was immediate. You saw legislatures. It was more than just ballot propositions. You saw propositions, but you also saw legislatures themselves doing tax cutting measures. But there was a gradual ramping up, I would say. Maybe started at, let's say, 1978. You can just fit a line to that, which is going up over time, and then it hits a peak in about 1990. So think of a gradual but consistent rise over that period.
So let's talk a little about public sentiment around direct democracy then. Do people like it? Does it poll well? Has that evolved and changed over time? What's the general consensus among voters and American citizens about how they feel about direct democracy?
So we have great data on this because people have been doing opinion polls for a long time. And in a volatile world, it's amazing how unvolatile opinion is on ballot propositions. If you ask people in every state, as we've seen surveys in every state, you'll get 3-1 or so say, yes, we want it. We think it's a great idea. We've had this going back in time. Voters have never not liked this idea, and it doesn't vary by state. It doesn't vary by demographic group. You can go into white voters, black voters, Asian voters, Hispanic voters. They all like it about 3-1. You go by age groups. You can ask people, do you think there should be voting on issues at the national level? You get 2 or 3-1 say yes on that. People like the idea of voting. And why is that? Well, there's another question that people ask, which is, who do you trust more to make decisions, the people or the elected officials? And you still get about 3-1 on that. So as much as if you read public discourse, which is a lot produced by, let's say, elites in some sense, there's deep skepticism toward direct democracy amongst pockets. But actual voters are not skeptical at all. They trust their fellow citizens and themselves more than they trust elected officials.
And it's very interesting that it hasn't really wavered over time, because there really aren't very many issues like that. Most issues, kind of go through waves and cycles. And
Yes.
to hear that consistency is very fascinating. So
Yes.
what kind of differences do you
And
see?
if I can just,
Go ahead.
Jeff,
Yeah,
if I could just add one thing there too, that
yeah, please.
sometimes people think, well, the voters are temperamental and they're emotional and, they don't make very wise decisions. The interesting thing about the stability of the polling is that voters have had plenty of time to learn that they can't trust themselves, right? They've seen themselves make decisions over many years. Maybe they're not as wise as the other people, and maybe this tax cut was a bad idea, and 20 years later, we'll regret it and change our minds. But we don't see that at all. We see them stick with their decisions. We see them consistently like their ability to do it. So they've had time now. It's one thing to ask people, what do you think about an idea that you've never tried? But they've been doing it for more than 100 years now, and they still like it. So that should tell us, I think, that it's been road tested now, and there's a basis now for voters thinking that they like this.
Part of what's so fascinating to me about this issue is that there are two things that stand out. One, the first thing you learn in history class in elementary school is the concept of checks and balances. It's one of the core founding principles of our country is checks and balances. And this is essentially just a checks and balances concept. The other thing that stands out is over the last decade or so, we've heard a lot of conversation nationally about democracy. Now, technically speaking, like ballot measures, that's direct democracy. The way our government is structurally set up, it's not a true democracy, because if it was a democracy, we, the people, would all be voting on all the laws and bills, and we'd be like Switzerland. But we're not. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic to see a lot of attention placed to democracy without the sort of acknowledgement that, technically speaking, if you want to talk about democracy in the United States, it takes the form of the initiative process. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. I just wrote a book a couple of years ago called Let the People Rule, but part of it was written for Americans, and I think we're all very proud of our democracy. We're very defensive of our democracy. We know that we were the first ones to do it. We collectively were the first ones to do it. What I think we don't realize is because we're so American focused is that we were the pioneers. We're the ones that showed the world to do this, but we're behind the curve now. What I mean by that is that just about every other nation in the world has people vote on issues at the national level. Okay, so what's a famous example? United Kingdom voted on Brexit, whether they wanted to leave the EU. Colombia voted on whether they wanted to do a peace treaty with a militia group. Taiwan votes on the national issues, abortion and stuff like same-sex marriage. We're one of, I believe, only 3 countries in the world that has never had a national vote on an issue. So strangely enough, even though we have a lot of democracy at the subnational level, and even though we're the pioneer of it, we're way behind everybody now in running democracy at the federal level. And I think that that's worth us reflecting on. I venerate our Constitution, our form of government, like everybody else. I'm not saying we should go in and just blow it up, but I do think we've always innovated it. We've always changed it. We've always improved it over time. And I think we should look around. And some people say, well, if people vote on things, it's just going to be the end of the world. But I look at many other functional democracies in the world, and they're voting on things, and it doesn't seem like the sky falls. So I think it might be time for us to be thinking a little bit about, as people increasingly are frustrated with the way our federal government works and increasingly telling pollsters they think it's undemocratic, maybe we should think about if there's ways we can tweak our institutions and maybe make it more democratic.
Yeah, it's very interesting. One of 3 countries that's very, very fascinating. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about, I'm just gonna say 3 words and let you riff on it here. Direct democracy backsliding.
Hmm.
Tell us about that.
So there have been some stories written in the last couple of years suggesting that there's been kind of systematic rise in attacks against direct democracy by state legislatures. And
Okay.
initiatives and referendums typically exist in a state's constitution. So it's not for legislators. Legislators can't just wake up one day and say, well, we're repealing it. It doesn't work like that. If they want to change it, it's in the constitution. So they have to go to a vote of the people to approve it. But what we're seeing is legislators putting a whole spate of proposals in the last couple of years where legislators try to make it harder to use. And they can do that in a bunch of different ways, and they do.
Yep.
One is they try to increase the number of signatures that are required to put a measure on the ballot, because clearly, if you require people to collect more signatures, it makes it harder. Another thing, we saw a very high-profile case in Ohio last year. They tried to make the approval rate go up. So in Ohio, for a constitutional amendment, you used to have to get 50% plus 1 vote to pass a constitutional amendment. They proposed to take it up to 60%. So it's try to make it harder. So there's been a number of stories about this. I tried to collect some information, trying to get a sense of if it's been growing over time. There's no doubt it's been happening, but those of us who've been following it long enough know that this, to some extent, this has always been happening. As we've kind of alluded to in this conversation, legislatures have never been very happy with this, and they've always chipped away at it. They've always tried to undercut it by making it harder to use. So I've collected some data trying to see if there's been a real big increase recently. I haven't looked at 2024, so I'm a little, you guys at Ballotpedia are much faster than we academics are, but so I don't know what 2024 was, but I didn't see a huge increase. But it's definitely something that's happening, certainly in states where legislators don't like what the voters are doing. We're seeing it more. The thing that happened in Ohio was because essentially the voters were going to use the initiative process to overrule the legislature on abortion and push a more centrist policy, and they wanted to try to block that. So this is something that I think should be monitored for those who like direct democracy, because it's kind of a subtle way. If you don't pay close attention, you might not even notice this is happening. It's presented as a way to kind of protect the integrity of the ballot. It's to stop special interests from taking over the process or something. But what it is in the end is making it harder to use.
Yeah, so one of the things I know we talked about this on the show previously, I think you talked to Ryan about it, our ballots editor, that there's an ebb and flow in state governments, and right now, we're in a kind of a peak of trifectas where most states, 40 of them, are single party controlled. And when you have single party control, essentially the minority party is going to feel a little bit like they don't have as much control. And what we've seen over time is that when one party is quite a bit of control, they want to shut down the initiative process a little more,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is sort of what you've been alluding to throughout this whole episode, is that it's a natural reaction for state legislators that they want to sort of have the control. They want to have the car keys, so to speak. So
In a world of partisanship and polarization, this is one thing the parties can agree on. Whichever party is in control, they want to respect direct democracy, Democrats or Republicans. So yeah,
you're right.
absolutely.
So, how do you think that the sort of wave at the start of the 20th century, what would they think of initiatives today? Where this is a speculative question of sorts, but so the sort of
Yeah.
call the godfathers of the initiative movement. What would they think if they saw what was at stake today and at play?
So I think they would be generally pleased that a lot of the stuff that they wanted to see done got done, and that people are having this chance. But it always was at root what I guess I would call a populist type of thing. I hesitate to use that word because sometimes that's people use that as a pejorative word. I don't mean in a pejorative way, just a descriptive way. It's a way for kind of ordinary people to push back if they think they're not being listened to. So I think I think the people who pushed this originally would be happy that it's still being used for that purpose. I think they might be a little bit perhaps disappointed because I think they thought they were gonna cure all the problems in American politics,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not so simple. Making democracy work is an ongoing process. It's never perfect. Every generation has to come and kind of fight the battles and protect it and make it better. So I think they might have thought that if we just do this, this will be a magic wand and cure, 95% of our problems. And I think more realistically, it cured 10 or 15% of the problems, but, it's not a
Yeah.
cure-all.
Your insights and historical knowledge are great. Really enjoyed talking to you about the issue, and I'm sure we'll have you back on again. John, thanks so much for the time and history lesson today.
Thank you for having me. I love to talk about this, so I'm glad you guys are talking about it too.
Me too. It won't be the last time.
All right.
All right. As I'm sure you can tell, I love hearing about all that history. There's so many different aspects of our political system today that we might take for granted and might not realize were once a pretty radical idea, like giving power directly to the people. I'm joined now by Ryan Byrne, Ballotpedia's editor, overseeing our ballot measures coverage. Ryan is an expert on the trends, data, and mechanics of citizen issues, and he spent years tracking how these measures shape policy across the country. Hey, Ryan, welcome back. How are you doing today?
Hey, Jeff, I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me again.
I want to start right off with something that, we've only spoken about when we kind of informally hung out at team meetings, but what is it about ballot measures that interests you? What do you love about ballot measures?
Yeah, that's actually a really hard question. They're a lot of fun to read about, to cover, to look at the data across time. But I think if I was to kind of pin it down to maybe one thing more than the others, it's just the variation. So, ballot measures are policies that people vote on, and measures can address a wide range of topics. It's never the same thing from social issues to tax and finance. I think it's actually kind of funny. Just this morning, I think I've read about or looked at material on ranked choice voting, sports betting, income taxes, and an attempt to eradicate weevils in Georgia 65 years ago with ballot measures. So, it's a lot of fun.
Where did that come from for you? When did you first learn about ballot measures? Do you remember?
I'll have to tell our guests I'm a resident of Pennsylvania, grew up in Pennsylvania. We don't have many ballot measures here. Occasionally there's a constitutional amendment. So I think my introduction to ballot measures, at least in depth, was through learning about Ballotpedia, over a decade ago, and some of the work that the ballot measures team at the time and that our President Leslie Graves was putting together. So, I've always been interested in policy. I've always been someone who, again, that variability where I don't really specialize in a particular policy. I love reading it, comparing it, thinking about it, and ballot measures just kind of, stuck out and were a natural thing to start studying in a professional capacity.
Yeah, the project you were referring to is our California ballot measures project, which was one of our first and earliest projects at Ballotpedia, was building out articles on every single ballot measure in California. And Ryan, now we've made a lot of progress on that and a number of other states as well. So how many ballot measures have there been historically in the United States?
Yeah, there's no one out there with an exact number yet. I hope we will have the exact number at some point. There's some, like I believe in Massachusetts, there were even some in the late 1700s. So, we know there's at least around 14,000. I suspect it's even higher once we kind of look back into the 1800s, probably closer to 15,000.
Yeah, there are actually fewer ballot measures, I think, on average now than there used to be, if I'm remembering correctly. Does that sound about right, Ryan?
Yeah, so if we went back to the 1800s, there were really just like these legislative referrals. So there were probably less back then, but then when you had the initiative process kind of kick off in the early 1900s, really up until the 2000s, you probably had more throughout the prior century.
What have you seen in terms of trends, let's say in the last few years? What's going on in the ballot measures space? Because it does go through waves and cycles.
I think people have talked a lot about the topics, and I can talk a bit more about the topics we've seen as well. But I think just the types of ballot measures is also really interesting. as I mentioned, right, during the 1900s, there were a lot more citizen initiatives than there have kind of been in the past couple years, on average. And that's something we really saw initiatives fall to a fairly low point over the past decade, but they kind of picked back up this year, which, was fun to see just purely from a coverage standpoint, gave us more interesting things to write about and think about. So, yeah, I think roughly over time, you've seen the initiative kind of go through waves as well in terms of when it was used, and then it was used a bit less, and then used more, and then used less. And of course, policy relates to that too. And, I'm sure we'll see that continue to ebb and flow in the future.
Topics, of course, change depending on the topical season. But, if we step back from just what we're talking about this year, earlier this year, we talked a lot about, say, abortion, ranked choice voting, the various issues that were coming up. But if you step back beyond one simple election cycle, generally, I think what we've seen over the last, several decades are the ebbs and flows when one party is in power in states, the minority party has, at least in the states with initiatives, they're going to use the initiative as sort of their tool to get these on the ballot. What I'm kind of curious about, sort of building that, is possible ballot measures. This is one of the really fun parts of what we do at Ballotpedia, is we cover all of the possible filed initiatives as well. And we sort of track and stay on top of those. That is a more recent development. We certainly don't know all the proposed initiatives from 1952, but we do know proposed initiatives in more recent years, right? So that allows us to understand that it's not just what happens with the initiatives that make the ballot, but also what doesn't make the ballot. And that can be quite telling as well. So when you step back from our coverage the last few years, what do you feel like we learned from the possible initiatives that don't ultimately make and go before voters?
Yeah, those are actually ones that aren't always connected to these broader trends. I think a lot of them tend to be more one off policies. And the ones that don't make the ballot are largely, and I think this will probably come up later in our conversation, ones that struggle to kind of receive funding from other organizations or individuals. But we do always see like some proposals that like get off the ground, but they don't quite make the cut. Yeah, and I think we see a lot of those still right now in the election policy space, and I expect that's something we'll see going forward. It is primarily something that is at this time more driven by like progressive organizations, but you do see like voter ID was just passed in Nevada. They got to vote on it again in 2026 due to a specific Nevada requirement. Voter ID is probably going to submit signatures in Maine for 2025. So I still think, it's something we've seen for the past couple of years, but we're still kind of seeing like these big conflicts over voting and election
Yeah,
policy.
and you mentioned easier and harder, and that is kind of interesting, right? Because it can be sort of subjective to some degree. Is it harder to get something on the ballot? Well, that just depends on whether you have the resources to pay the initiative circulators to qualify it. So, can you explain a little more what I mean by that?
Yeah, so whether the process is easier or harder, I think everyone can probably understand that in an abstract sense. It's going to be easier in some states with certain rules, it's going to be harder in other states. It is quite subjective. So, one way that we've kind of tried to think about it is like you were saying about resources. Like, does it just take more resources for a campaign if this particular policy is in place? And, some policies are really tricky to kind of figure out, but others are things that people aren't necessarily going to disagree with. Like if you have more days to collect signatures, it's probably going to be easier. If you have less days, it's going to be harder. Things of that sort. So, we've actually conducted some comparisons on some of these factors. We haven't necessarily like aggregated them into an index, which could be interesting, but then gets into like I think more subjectivity. But for example, like every initiative state has a different signature requirement. But some states, like California, have a really big population, and other states, like the Dakotas, have a smaller population. So it's a little hard to compare them. So we've compared them based on like the percentage of registered voters required. In which case, like you see, like Nebraska has the highest, and Massachusetts, you only need less than 1% of registered voters to get a referendum on the ballot.
Right. So you need it's harder to get things on the ballot, technically speaking, because you require more work, more resources to get the required number of signatures. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there's other factors, right? So, like in Nebraska, yeah, it's taking 10% of registered voters, but maybe you have more days, right? And things of that sort. Massachusetts, less than 1% for a veto
Right.
referendum, but you only got 90 days, which is actually pretty common for veto
Right.
referendums. But
Certainly a case of federalism at play here, where every state really is, their own particular landscape. So you kind of mentioned a little bit about what topics we've seen over the years. What other issues do you see sort of playing out in the next few years ahead as we prepare our own coverage?
Yeah, so with the initiatives, I think one thing that's actually kind of interesting, and again, this is a bit more of a broad answer, is like I said, there's been this ebb and flow with initiatives. There's been an ebb and flow, and like you were referencing on who uses them. I think in the 80s and 90s, we saw a lot of, what I think people would classify as more conservative type initiative. It was a period that was often referred in literature as the tax revolt, and that manifested through ballot initiatives. So I'm really curious, like, does the ballot initiative remain a primarily progressive tool? I mean, there's definitely conservatives that utilize it, especially in states with like Democratic trifectas, like
Yeah.
Washington and Colorado. But those haven't necessarily manifested into a trend. They tend to be like one-off type policies. So I'm very curious, like, will conservative organizations start utilizing the ballot initiative more in some of these more Democratic states? We're definitely seeing it play out in a few states, but will a bigger trend pick up?
Are there any states that are theoretically trying to add the initiative, a 27th state of sorts, or does it seem like it's kind of like leveled off and it would take a pretty strong change for our state to become a 27th?
Yeah, I think it would take a pretty strong change. I mean, you see, like I mentioned Mississippi earlier, their whole system's kind of on hold right now due to a court ruling, and some legislators, including from both political parties, are trying to revive it. Others aren't necessarily. We haven't necessarily seen a big motion in recent years to get a new initiative state. I mean, you could think of maybe something theoretical, like a state that was a Republican trifecta for a really long time, became a Democratic one, or vice versa, and maybe they're thinking, oh, we should get the initiative process on the books before we, lose power again, potentially for a long period of time.
Right.
We've seen that play out a little bit, but we haven't like in terms of those political dynamics, we haven't really seen anyone propose the initiative.
Right. So, because again, so to actually just step back, how would a state add the initiative process? What has to happen?
Yeah, so that's going to require a state constitutional amendment, which means that the legislature is going to have to put it on the ballot, which different states have, again, like initiatives, different rules for how to get amendments on the ballot out of the legislature, but it would require a constitutional amendment, which voters would then need to approve.
Right. So there would need to be a pretty big groundswell, you can imagine, for state legislators to give up some of their power to the voters and to give that up themselves. Would certainly be very interesting. I live in South Carolina, which is one of two states that selects its judges through the state legislature. And, there's always been kind of a conversation in the state that the only way they would lose that is if the state legislators themselves put an amendment on the ballot to change the selection system. There's a lot of different ways judges they can be elected by the people, they can be appointed by a governor, they can be appointed by the Senate. There's a lot of different methods that different states use. But the South Carolina State Legislature, odds are they don't want to give up that power. I imagine you're saying it's the same kind of thing with the citizen initiative. It would take quite a bit of groundswell for a state legislature to decide, yep, let's go ahead and give up some of our power.
Yeah, exactly, because it is a legislative power, and that's kind of the some of the Supreme Court rulings that we have on it have classified it as such. It's essentially an extension of the legislature, just going straight to voters via the policy on the ballot rather than through representatives. So yes, they would need to cede some of their power to the initiative process.
Let's just sort of remind our listeners, ballot measures and initiatives, those terms can at times be confused. They don't mean the exact same thing. So can you define what is the difference between a ballot measure and a citizen initiative? Because sometimes when you read a news article, you might see the terms used interchangeably, but they should not be.
Yeah, so you can kind of think of, all initiatives are ballot measures, but not all ballot measures are initiatives, right? So a ballot measure is just a law issue, sometimes even just a non-binding question. We can just use law for shorthand. A law that appears on the ballot for voters to decide. Those can come from citizens or those can come from legislatures. There's also a whole nother realm of automatic ballot measures, but again, that's getting into some details. So initiatives, people propose them, people collect signatures, people put them on the ballot, not legislators. Legislators can also put measures on the ballot. So ballot measures include initiatives, but initiatives are a particular type of process.
A lot of complicated terminology in there. Great to have you help clarify that for us today, Ryan, and appreciate your insights and coverage of this issue.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Listeners, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our exploration of initiative history with someone who had a direct role in getting initiatives in front of voters, share what that experience was like, their experience advocating for the political tool, and more. This is On the Ballot. Stay tuned.
Happy holidays! We're thrilled to kick off the 12 days of Ballotpedia, a celebration of the essential, unbiased political insights we bring to you every day. Throughout the season, we're highlighting key areas of our mission, sharing how Ballotpedia empowers voters with reliable information on the issues and elections that shape our lives. As we look toward 2025, your support remains crucial. It's because of you that we can continue expanding our reach and refining our tools to keep every voter informed. To donate, please visit donate.ballotpedia.org/12 days of BP 2024. Every contribution fuels our efforts to deliver top-notch information on politics and policy. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Your encouragement inspires our team and makes our work possible. We're excited to see what 2025 will bring, and we're grateful to have you on our side.
We've been on the sidelines now for most of our episode. Let's get into the mix and learn a little bit more of the inside baseball around initiatives and how they actually work. I'd like to welcome Dane Waters to the show, founder of the Initiative and Referendum Institute and a global advocate for direct democracy. Dane is widely regarded as an authority on the philosophy and practice of citizen lawmaking, with decades of experience working to expand and refine the initiative process both in the US and internationally. Dane, welcome to the show. Great to see you.
Well, great to be here. It's good to see you as well.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk a whole lot about ballot measures. So, Dane, first, tell our listeners, what is it that drew you to become an advocate for the ballot initiative process?
Well, that's a good question. I grew up in Alabama, and in Alabama, we don't have the initiative process. And then I went to work for an organization called U.S. Term Limits way back when, like 20, 30, my God, it's almost over 30 years ago. And my job was to figure out how to put initiatives on the ballot because they were doing national initiatives all over. And so in researching the process, I realized, hey, this is an amazing process. It gives people the opportunity to voice opinions on issues. So got really excited. And from that, I've just become a lifelong supporter of direct democracy and the initiative process because it truly is the one tool out there to give people the opportunity to voice their opinion on issues that lawmakers, for whatever reason, want to address.
So I'm sure you have a number of stories over the years, and one of the things I really want to get into in our segment here is what's it really like, on a ballot measure, on an initiative campaign. We've talked on this episode a lot about the numbers behind them and the history behind them, but what's it really like going out there and collecting signatures? Can you kind of paint a picture for listeners about that?
Well, it's one of those issues that unless you've actually collected signatures and you've been on the street, people just honestly just can't get an appreciation for, how difficult the process is. People think that, oh, there's too many initiatives on the ballot. It's so easy to put an issue on the ballot. You're paying people $20 a signature, to put issues on the ballot. But let me tell you, the story is, for example, let's take Montana for an example, where Montana is an extremely rural state. And, they have this distribution requirement for signatures where you have to collect so many signatures from each state legislative district. And first of all, no one knows what their state legislative district is. So when you try to go to a shopping mall or a Walmart or something like that, you say, hey, what legislative district are you in? They say, well, I don't know. And so half the signatures you collect are not usable because you don't have the right legislative district. And the other thing is you don't have places to collect signatures, especially if you're trying to collect signatures in the winter. Where do you go? You can't go to the post office. You can't go to box stores. There's no one walking the sidewalks. So just the physical act of collecting signatures, no matter how small the number may be, is just one of the most difficult things about the initiative process, not counting all the other issues associated with it. So
Now, it's been process that has used paid signatures forever. It's something that has been around since initiatives began. But what's different from, the 90s? If you fast forward from the 90s to today, 30 years, what feels different about the way people, because conceptually it's the same thing. You're walking around with a clipboard and a pen and a paper. You're trying to collect signatures. Well, what's different?
Well, I think if you fast forward a couple of things, I think that one is that the environment is such that more people order things online and they don't go out and shop. So just the sheer size or the audience that you could potentially get signatures from is a lot smaller. So signature gatherers have to work harder now than they ever did because they don't have as many people to ask to collect signatures. That's number one. Number two, I just think that, we have lawmakers, and I'm not going to bash lawmakers, but I'm going to say, that, they just really don't like the initiative process. I'm sure the other people on the show may have talked about it.
Mhm.
And so they've made it progressively harder by, adding distribution requirements, limiting who can collect signatures and things of this nature. So that's changed a lot. I would say since the 90s, the new restrictions in the process have grown exponentially. And the other thing is that people just, as a society, I just don't think that people have the same patience that they used to talk to people on the street. No matter, it's not just about signature collecting; it's about anything, whether you're trying to raise money for a nonprofit or whatever. So, I think the environment has just gotten a little bit more hostile, not toward the process, but just in general toward people interacting with other people on the street.
When you say collecting signatures, so we'll sort of break it down simpler for our listeners. Where can they collect them? You said they can't collect them in box stores. So where can they collect signatures?
Well, technically, you're supposed to be able to collect signatures in what they call in public spaces. So, if a park, in theory, you can collect signatures on any public sidewalk, like walking down the sidewalk, you can collect signatures. If it's an event, like I guess Burning Man, I guess is an event, right, in Nevada. You can go there. But what's happening is that now the law has been changed so that it used to be that if there's an open area and where people can collect together individually, you can collect signatures that's considered a public space, right? Well, now the laws in a lot of states are that the organizer of the events can say, no, we want to allow the signatures to be gathered. But like, in Denver, for example, if there's a big concert outside the venue, you can collect signatures on the public sidewalks outside the venue. You can collect signatures at the metro stops, or you can collect signatures going door to door in many states as well. But, and a lot of people actually now collect signatures at the end of church services on Sunday. Because the good thing about that is that most people who go to a specific church, they live in a specific area, so they know, if it's a distribution requirement, they know where they live.
Hmm.
But I mean, outside of that, it's very difficult. We the Initiative Referendum Institute, we filed a lawsuit against the Postal Service years ago about allowing signature gathering there, and the end result of that is that the postmaster of each post office gets to decide, if he or she wants people to collect signatures there. So
Oh, on an individual level.
it's a huge
Hmm.
on an individual level. So, it's great that the post office gave that individual authority to the postmaster, but almost every postmaster says, no, you can't do it. And he or she has the authority to do that. So it's very, very difficult to find places to collect signatures.
Right. Okay, so you've done a lot of work, not just domestically, but internationally in the democracy space. So tell our listeners a little bit about what's it like outside the United States with initiatives, or what kind of interesting experience have you had? What's the one best story you can tell that kind of depicts for us? Okay, so everyone in America knows what life is like here. We often forget there are other countries that also have political processes. So, how does direct democracy work elsewhere?
Well, listen, it's actually more fondly embraced internationally. I mean, you look in a country like Switzerland, where it's kind of a way of life. People embrace it. They expect signature gatherers to ask you to collect signatures, and so it's really a more welcoming process. In Germany, at the local level, what you see, which is interesting, they'll have a signature drive, but they use a lot of buses, so they'll actually take a bus and drive around and park the bus and say, come collect signatures, and people will actually walk up to the bus to collect the signatures, because once again, it's not considered it's not considered a horrible process or an intrusive process in most places around the world. So I think the biggest difference is the fact that people welcome it, they like it, they like having the ability to address some of the issues that they care a lot about. So that's the number one difference. The other is there aren't as many restrictions in the process. I mean, it's easier in some countries, like Germany and Switzerland and others. It's easier to collect signatures. One of my crazy stories is that it's a recall. Recall is also where you collect signatures. Venezuela, years and years ago, when Chavez was in charge, there was an initiative campaign or recall campaign to collect signatures to get rid of him down there. So I advised on that. And it was actually a party. They would have parties. They would throw parties in the street. And it was a very
Hmm.
fun, exciting. Of course, then he just negated everything and said it wasn't, legit. So that's what happens when you're a dictator. But I would say that it's a lot more fun to do initiative campaigns around the world than the United States, and also a lot of the places around the world, they're at the national level, which is a whole nother issue for us in the U.S. Is that I do believe there should be an initiative process at the national level as well.
What kind of issues do you see internationally? Is it kind of the same things we see here? Minimum wage, abortion, economic issues, voting issues, or is it much different?
No, I think, it's what we call the bread and butter issues about taxes and way of life issues are all typically the same. I mean, in the European Union, they do have a citizens initiative process at the European Union level where you collect signatures and it forces issues to be put to the European Union for consideration. And I mean, they deal with the big issues like climate change, trade, things about, what is the future of the European Union, things of that nature. But listen, when you look at Germany and Switzerland, they do the same things we do. They do things on animal welfare issues, whether to ban the certain industrial production of meat. It's the same issues that we care about. And just listen, we're a global world, but at the end of the day, we all care about the same things: is how much money we have, whether to put food over our head, how we care about our animals, and how we regulate government. So we all live in the same world, dealing with the same issues.
So let's say so you knew someone starting up an initiative campaign here in the U.S. What advice or what kind of general concepts does that campaign or person have to think about when they're thinking about an initiative here in the States?
Well, the first thing is they have to understand that it's not an easy process. They first have to brace themselves. It's kind of like a marriage. You have to brace yourself before you go into it and understand.
Yeah.
I'm not speaking about marriages, but anyway,
Be communicative.
that's right. You have to
Yeah.
understand that you're all in or you're not, because it's a huge
Mhm.
investment. But the rewards are great as well. Is that there's nothing better than on election night when you win something, and you know that all that hard work actually paid off and it became law. But no, I think that first they need to recognize that the establishment, using that term loosely, but primarily the government, is not going to be your friend in the process typically. So you need to make sure that you have the right resources, legal resources, legal advice on your side to advise you. That's number one. Number two, when you're collecting signatures, don't live in an ivory tower thinking that 100% of the signatures are going to be valid. A lot of people think that. They say, oh, if we need 20,000 signatures, we got 20,001, we're okay. No, I live in a world where thinking 50% of my signatures are going to be bad. So you need to collect, that much more. So understand that, and understand that whomever you're going against, whether it's real estate developers, zoning laws, or whatever, people aren't going to remain silent. They're going to come after you. But as I said, you got to stay the course and be committed, because America is a much better country because we have the ability, and where it's available, to put issues on the ballot. And I think it has made fundamental changes and difference in America that made us a much better country.
What's the international signature rate look like? Actually, you said here, 50%. Is that the same thing internationally? Same thing state and local? Or is it, are there typically more validated signatures at the international level?
No, listen, I think that even the people I deal with understand they always go by the 50% rule. It's just always better.
Yeah.
And plus, politically, it's always, if the signature total you need is 20,000, you want to show support for that. So you'll submit 60,000 or something like that, just to show that there's popular support for the issue. So I think that even from a PR standpoint, it's important. But
Yeah.
listen, you don't want to put all the money, time, energy, and effort and come up short. I mean, once again, to talk about this Montana campaign, I remember we did all this work and we came up, we didn't meet our distribution requirement. We came up like 170 signatures short. And at the end of the day, it's a hard pill to swallow. That's why you make sure you do the front end work you need to assure that doesn't happen.
So signature gathering it kind of seems like it's one of the last remaining parts of our general society, not just political society, but general society, that has not moved to electronic yet. You buy a house, you can e-sign everything. You do a will, you can usually e-sign, I think. Well, I'm not a lawyer, so we won't go with that as legal advice. But
Yeah, don't take legal advice from Jeff.
Dane can open a bank account overseas. You can e-sign. So there's a lot of parts of our society now that we've moved to that you can e-sign for. DocuSign, PandaDocs. There's a bunch of companies out there who do it. What about the initiative process? Is there a future where there's a push to move in that direction? Is there a reason why it's still what they would call wet signatures, or where do you think you see that going?
Well, listen, it is a big issue. I think that anybody involved in the initiative process has been advocating for signature gathering online forever. I mean, this is something that's been talked about since 1999 when we held our first national conference or international conference on direct democracy in the United States. The technology there, everyone knows that it's there. I believe it's Boulder, Colorado, allows signature gathering online. So it is possible. But the reality is, though the people want it, those in power typically don't like the initiative process, don't want to make it easier. Once again, we talked about this from the 1990s to today. What's the biggest difference? Well, one of the biggest differences is the newer restrictions on using the initiative process. And part of that is, and they're all designed to make the process more difficult. And allowing signature gathering online would make the process easier. So there's just this, all it would require is a simple legislative change in a place like California. They say, the California Assembly tomorrow can say, we allow signature gathering online, and we just instruct local registrars to figure out the implementation of it. And it would happen. That's all it would take. So the only issue behind it is just lawmakers just don't want to allow it to happen. And that's the impediment.
Well, where else do you think you see us head in the land of initiatives? You've been around this space for a long time now. Where's it going the next 10 or 20 years, you think?
Well, I think that the people as a country, just talking about specifically the U.S. and now come internationally, is that, as we all know, right, wrong, or indifferently, the amount of vitriol in our political process is increasing exponentially, sadly. The divide between the right and the left is increasing exponentially. And so, that anger is going to have to manifest itself in something. I always argue that the initiative process is a safety valve and allows people, when they're just so frustrated, to do something. So I think that you're going to have the people demanding, in many ways, greater access to the initiative process, both at the local level and the national level. And so I do see at some point in time, I'm optimistic that lawmakers are going to have to break and allow greater access. So I'm hopeful of that. I don't see, listen, every poll that's ever done about the initiative process shows that the people support the process overwhelmingly. So it's not something that they're going to want to give up anytime soon. So I see that domestically. I think globally, there's even a movement in the United Nations about, creating a global initiative process, deal with global issues. There's a lot of issues associated with that. But outside the United States, the interest and even among governments to expand the initiative process is there. So I think you're going to see a greater growth exponentially in direct democracy at a global level versus what's happening in the United States. And I would hope, I think it's going to be difficult, but I'd hope that the U.S. would eventually get on some kind of parity with what's happening around the world.
Well, Dane, it was great to see you. Great to have you on to share all your insights about the history of your experiences with Initiative Referendum campaigns. And be well globally, and I'll see you stateside one of these days.
Listen, it's a great honor to be with you, Jeff, and thanks for having me.
For our fourth and final guest, I'm joined by Dan Smith, a professor of political science at the University of Florida and a renowned researcher on state politics and direct democracy. Dan's work dives deep into the political dynamics of ballot measures and the tensions between citizen-driven initiatives and state legislatures. Dan, thanks for coming on the show.
Glad to be here.
So we've talked a lot on this show with other guests and at times about the history behind this citizen initiative process. And there are different theories and takes on why it's stopped. It's not in all 50 states. What has your research found? What's kind of your perspective on why didn't it go to all 50 states? Why did it end at 26?
In some states, the citizens actually said no thanks. So these initiatives went on the ballot in places like Florida in 1911, I think it was, and Texas and Wisconsin, Minnesota, a couple other states. And the citizens said, this is okay, but it's not as good of a deal as we want. And then they didn't have another opportunity to adopt.
Interesting.
And so we don't have the initiative process in Texas or Wisconsin or Minnesota. Florida got it in 1968 through a new constitution, but it wasn't given to them by the state legislature. This was a constitutional convention that was included in there. So that period of time was a really interesting one where you have the progressive era, where there's a lot of more centralized control and state control, taking it away from citizens, and especially the rabble. These new immigrants were coming in, unwashed masses that were taking over the machinery of politics. Progressive era was pretty conservative in some of the reforms, quote unquote, that they were doing. And you had on the flip side this more populist effort across many of the states, not only in the West, but mostly in the West, to give citizens more opportunity. And that kind of came out because of the discord that was going on, where you had parties that were fairly weak and you had many minor parties coming in, kind of tipping the balance. And these coalitions that were being created on both more conservative and more liberal sides saying, hey, we can actually maybe advance our opportunities by giving away some of our institutional power to be able to say, hey, we are the party of the people, not the other major party that they're competing with. So it was an interesting dynamic going on at that time with third parties having a major role. Since that time, third parties have been kind of rendered out of this question in most state legislatures, and you really haven't had that opportunity. That said, it's a really interesting question. There are a lot of states that could adopt direct democracy because they've got unified control and they don't have the initiative process and they're not doing it. And so one of the things I always like to think about is, well, is this a right or left thing? Well, Connecticut has full control by Democrats, and yet there's no effort there to devolve power to citizens, with the initiative process. You have full control of legislatures in Texas by Republicans. There is no effort among the Republican Party to be giving the initiative to its citizens. And as a result, you basically have these parties that have monopoly control that are not terribly interested in devolving power to citizens, which effectively is going to break up that legislative monopoly.
Yeah, it would certainly take a sort of groundswell movement from a candidate or a whole party in a state to say, we want to put this in and we want to be voted and elected in on this platform. And it really hasn't been a popular platform for a party to take in 20, 30 years, really, since Mississippi in 92. Has anyone actually really seemingly run on a platform of, I want to push for the initiative process?
Yeah, historically speaking, at the congressional level, Dick Gephardt actually led some efforts in the late 1970s as a member of the House to have a national referendum. But if you're thinking about national politicians pushing for the initiative process, you really have to go back to the 1912 presidential election, which was crazy already because you had this bull moose party of a former president, Teddy Roosevelt, moving forward, who was clearly pushing the initiative and referendum when he was on the hustings going around barnstorming around the country. The Democratic candidate who ends up prevailing, Woodrow Wilson, he is an elitist. He is a Southerner. He is a former president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey. And he despises the idea that citizens are going to be taking over the legislative reins. At the same time, when he was out campaigning in the West, he said, maybe this should be left to the citizens of these states to decide whether they want to adopt direct democracy. And he came around. It was completely political, gaming that he was trying to get votes by saying, yeah, maybe we should support the initiative process out in Colorado or in California, states that were just about adopting in the 1910s. And basically said, all right, direct democracy, it's not great, but let's think about it as this gun behind the door. It could be a mighty good persuader if it needs to be used. But he was not a believer in small d democratic procedure, unlike Teddy Roosevelt. He was using it for gamemanship. But we really haven't seen the initiative process being at the national level of conversation, except for the concerns about policies being so divergent. I guess this last election, maybe the first time we've really heard about it. And it was mostly Donald Trump talking about, hey, let citizens decide whether or not reproductive rights should be expanded or not. And how is that going to be done? Largely through the initiative process of all these ballot measures of either overturning what the state legislatures have done or overturning what the Supreme Court has basically done with respect to ending Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see if in future election cycles, presidential candidates ever take this up as a sort of a platform again. Let's talk about voter turnout then.
Yeah.
You often hear within an election cycle specifically that, this citizen initiative is being put on the ballot to drive turnout. What about over the long term? Yeah, has voter turnout in elections with major initiatives been studied? What's the sort of data look like there?
Yeah, so I wrote a book with Carolyn Tolbert called Educated by Initiative. And part of that book that came out in 2004 was dedicated to looking longitudinally at states with and without the initiative process and looking at turnout at the aggregate level in both presidential and midterm elections. And what we find is pretty strong evidence that controlling for a whole range of other factors in terms of other things that are going on in that state, competitive elections and whatnot for candidates, is that both having the initiative process and using the initiative process, meaning the number of initiatives on the ballot, both lead to greater turnout. That greater turnout happens to be higher in midterm elections, which makes some sense, right? If you have presidential elections, people are already predisposed, especially those peripheral voters, to turn out to vote because of the prominence of that campaign. It's the midterm elections where you already see drop-off of turnout, where those ballot measures may lead to higher turnout. And where you really see it is obviously in special elections where there might be an initiative on the ballot, but turnout is up because of the prominence of that issue as opposed to if it's not. And so we've seen that. And the examples are numerous. One that I like thinking about is Prop 13 back in 1978 in California, right? That was on a June primary election. There were more votes cast for Prop 13 than there were for the gubernatorial candidates in the primaries that were running in that election. Turnout was huge in that election for Prop 13, which overwhelmingly passes, a rebuke of the Democratic-controlled state legislature and Jerry Brown, the governor at the time, that were really doing nothing about the increased property taxes that were harming folks. And Howard Jarvis, played that populist card, even though he was the head of the Los Angeles Apartment Owners Association. And one of the things that's locked in with respect to property taxes are commercial properties in California. They are locked in at a rate of 1978. And as a result, property taxes for commercial properties, especially if they've been passed down, are a lot less than if you move to California and want to buy a new house, which is locked in a much higher rate. So, he was no dummy. He played the old ladies, crumpled up dollar bills, sending them to him.
Right.
But it really did drive turnout, and it also sparked the whole anti-tax movement in the 1980s that Grover Norquist eventually took over in the 1990s with his Americans for Tax Reform.
That's really interesting about the turnout factor, especially because one of the things we have talked a lot about this year about Ballotpedia are just the volume of uncontested elections in the country. So 585,000 elected officials, and roughly speaking, from what we've seen this year, 70% of elections are uncontested because the vast majority of elections are local, and there's just a lot of coroners and mosquito abatement board commissioners who run unopposed.
Exactly.
And if there's an unopposed election, it's not a lot of incentive for voters to turn out and vote. In some cases, they're actually straight up canceled. They don't even appear on a ballot. But it's fascinating. If you really think about it, a ballot measure in and of itself is always contested because there's always a yes or a no that you can cast at the polls. You can't really cast no at the polls unless you live in Nevada and you can do none of the above. But that's kind of interesting to think about. If you think about it through that lens, that a ballot measure itself is a way to engage the citizenry, to give them something to civically participate in, because when candidates run unopposed, it kind of motivates voters to stay away from the polls and probably decreases turnout. So I hadn't thought about it through that lens before, but you're right. That's fascinating. What were some of the early arguments in opposition to the initiative, and are any of those still in play today when those come out?
Oh, they're absolutely still in play. We're seeing the attacks on the initiative process going on in states that have adopted it, and it's on the right and the left. And these are the same kind of arguments that were heard over 100 years ago, where citizens aren't paying attention. They don't know what they're doing. This is too complicated, that the issues are being dominated by special interests that are taking over this process. And we're seeing that in red states like Florida, where there's huge opposition to the initiative process among the Republican majority in Tallahassee, and Governor DeSantis actively campaigning against the marijuana measure and the reproductive measure here. But you're also seeing in places like Colorado that, again, has had that process for 114 years, where Democrats are constantly whittling away at the initiative process. And the reason is simple. Those parties, Republicans in Florida, Democrats in Colorado, have monopoly control over the legislature. They don't like the median voter having his or her way in a statewide electorate when they've already gamed the system to have control over the state legislature through redistricting process and so forth. And so the same type of arguments that it's a poor way to make decisions, of having a yes or no vote. These are nuanced issues. And what the attacks have been the exact same. In 1912 in Colorado, there were 32 measures on the ballot, and 26 of them were initiated by citizens, either citizen initiatives or what we call popular referendums, where legislature had passed something and then the citizens collected signatures to challenge those at the polls. And these the same kind of arguments, because the same kind of thing is going on. There was paid signature gathering going on in 1912. 3 cents
Yep.
a signature at that time, which is,
A little more expensive today.
yeah, it's a little more expensive today, but it's still, it was real money. There was a lot of duplicity where you had corporate interests that were supposedly supporting a 8-hour workday, but it was actually a much more regressive 8-hour workday than what the legislature had just passed. And so duplicity of putting contradicting measures on the ballot and trying to confuse voters. The step away from that after the election was, oh, we need to start regulating this process. This is crazy. But the cat was out of the bag, and it's really difficult to do that. But Colorado has done that. They have put all kinds of restrictions on the initiative process since Democrats took over, and didn't like the fact that the median citizen may be voting for them into office, but were also putting limitations on taxes that they didn't like, or passing conservative ballot measures at the polls. So again, this dynamic is true, and it has been consistent for over 100 years about not the party in control, but the party that is in control. It doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats. It's whoever's in control doesn't like that counter pressure coming from citizens
Yeah.
through the initiative process.
Yeah. This is not a direct initiative. No, but you're reminding me about what life was like in 2010 with redistricting, when before the election in North Carolina, for instance, the minority party introduced a bill to create an independent redistricting commission. The majority party at the time said, no, thank you. We're fine. We like drawing the maps ourselves. Of course, the election changed control of the state legislature. Now the new minority party asked for this independent redistricting commission. Nope. New majority party said, we're just fine. Thank you very much. And we see this certainly across the country, is whoever has the power likes to keep the power. So where do you see the initiative process going in the next 5 or 10 years? Do you think we're at a sort of rising boom period again, or are we about to head into a little trough like we had in the 40s and 50s?
Yeah, there certainly was a trough in the 40s and 50s, and no one's really been able to distill why that happened. But I certainly have noticed in my time series of looking at the initiative process, it's hard to say. There's booms and busts with respect to different issues, and there's a certain limit in terms of how much it can go, right? You're either going to pass this measure. Minimum wage has been a little different, where they've reoccurred maybe a decade later and indexed to inflation or whatnot. But I don't know what the next big issue is going to be. Are we going to see measures going on the ballot on transgendered rights, for instance? I don't know. What is the next big social issue that is going to come down the pike? Are there going to be economic issues? I thought at one point, the millionaire tax that was popular in Washington and California, whether that would come across the country, but we really haven't seen that. Putting measures on the ballot is difficult. It's costly. You have to have someone bankrolling it, either a group or an individual. It's very few measures that are coming from small donor, citizen initiative driven in that classic sense. But from my perspective, that's never been the case. There's always been an interest behind it that is vested in moving something forward or opposing a measure. I'm not sure where we're going to see it. I know that we're going to have more regulation of the initiative process in those states in which the median voter has done something different from what the state legislature had legislated. And so that is a certainty, is that we're going to see efforts to do that. And, there's a certain hubris in regulating the initiative process. That hubris is that you're going to be in control for the rest of eternity, until eternity, right? That you're always going to have the monopoly control, as opposed to, maybe at some point you're going to be in the minority and want to use the initiative process again. So there is this arrogance of power that comes with these regulating the initiative process. But, I'd never let that slip by, state lawmakers.
Yeah, it is. We're certainly at a peak of trifecta control, where we have, almost the entirety of the country is either a trifecta or certainly unified legislative rule. And it wasn't always that way. There was a significant number of divided states 15 years ago, even. So,
Yeah, I think it's
and I
a
think to
really
your
important.
yeah,
And you mentioned North Carolina. That's one of these battleground states where the legislature is really, not necessarily that close, but the governor is of the other party. You have Pennsylvania, another non-initiative state that the legislature isn't hanging in the balance. You have a Democratic governor, in both those places, you could see the argument being made by a political party that wants to solidify its power of using the initiative process. I mean, Josh Shapiro could be out there pushing the initiative process, which is going to be popular among citizens. And maybe that would help solidify power in the state legislature. Or, the new governor in North Carolina pushing this to see if they can whittle away some of those Republican lawmakers that are either a supermajority or a strong majority in that state. You can use this process still in that populist sense that, certainly Donald Trump has ridden to power now twice of playing kind of a more populist card, like, and most recently with the abortion issue. I mean, it's a really interesting thing of saying, we're going to just devolve it down to the citizens to make that choice. Obviously, citizens in some states have more of a voice because of the initiative process than in others, but it's an interesting strategy to play that card that has been around for over a century. And there's a lot of indication that we're in this populist moment.
The country has been a pendulum swinging nation for several hundred years, right? That's kind of like a very American way. We like this party, we change our mind, we go to the other party. I mean, it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it kind of does feel like and I'm sure there's been academic studies on this, that in the early years of America's founding, there was a focus around the minority party. How can we build a system that gives some power to the minority party? And you think about that then if you're in power, you're like, okay, well, one day I will be the minority. And it kind of feels like it's a recent phenomenon that those who are in the majority don't use that same power of discretion. I mean, the most famous example after 20 years is probably Harry Reid with the filibuster and judges. That, there are now more and more decisions frequently in recent years where those who are in the majority at the time are making decisions about the rules that if they were in the minority, they would hate those rules. And then it comes back around again, it seems like. Have you done any studies on that or seen anything on that?
No. So, I mean, look, it's basically the Burkean notion of a loyal, opposition. And the majority needs to have a loyal opposition to be able to gain the respect of the voter, that you don't want to just be using your power indiscriminately to accrue all the resources and power and insulate yourself, that you need to have some balance. And, it's interesting that certainly Colorado in the 1990s, when Republicans were controlling the state legislature, we'll see if it's going to happen in states like Florida or Texas or even North Carolina. It doesn't seem so, but there used to be fissures within the dominant political party. Even though they had control, there could be possibilities for bipartisan deal making because you would have the social conservative and the fiscal conservative Republicans differing on a lot of issues. And so you could have this policy. It's difficult to think that now because certainly the elites in political parties in the American system have become so polarized, much more polarized than the American electorate. And so the initiative process should be a time for that self-reflection. It should be a time in these states, be it on the right or the left, where a measure that is opposed to the party that is in control passes, of saying, hey, what's going on here? The citizens seem to have passed a measure in which we have opposed, but they can't get there unless they have support of the other citizenry. And yet there's very limited reflection in that way. It's more like, we got to clamp this down. We got to stop this from happening in the future. And I think in that sense, that gun behind the door, as Wilson called it, that gun behind the door can get some issues through, but it's not the same way that Wilson was thinking about it, which was actually putting a check on the legislature,
Right.
and legislative control. And so we've kind of lost that. And I think it's largely because the groupthink within political parties and the effective polarization that has happened, where Republicans just despise Democrats, and especially in state legislatures, and Democrats despise Republicans in state legislatures, has become so toxic that the ability to kind of think through these moments in which the citizens have figured it out, they've passed these measures, sometimes with supermajorities. What are they saying that we should be thinking about that would make us govern in a way in which we're maybe more productive, but it could come at a cost in terms of our control?
Well, Dan, it was great having you on the show today. Appreciate the time. And we'll have to certainly pay close attention to what happens at the ballot measure landscape in the future. So Great to see you. Thanks very much.
Hey, great to be on your show, and good luck with all the work you're doing at Ballotpedia.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our ballot measure coverage at the link in our show notes. If you're here on this part of the episode, I'm really glad you've made it through nearly 2 hours of history about ballot measures. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for listening.